It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the very first annual Arts Plus Agency Week. It's a virtual event, of course, virtual given the circumstances we are currently in. It's a virtual event designed to explore the ways arts are being leveraged to raise awareness of systemic issues or to amplify the underrepresented voices. And also, I believe, to generate creative solutions to many of the societal challenges. Funding for this Arts Plus Agency Week was provided in part by Erie Community Foundation through their Shaping Tomorrow grant program. Hi, my name is Amanpreet Oberoi. I'm the president of Erie Asian Pacific American Association, or Erie APA, as we are more commonly known as. Here at Erie APAA, our mission is to promote awareness of diverse Asian Pacific cultures to the Erie community through educational and cultural activities and also cultural events that we organize. Some of those events are Festival of Asia, Taste of Asia, Multicultural Asia Day. These are some of our flagship events. Now, these Erie APA also provides opportunities for Asian Pacific Americans and their friends in Erie region to network and share their very own experiences. Today, I have the privilege of introducing Mr. John Rubin. John, I would say, John is an interdisciplinary artist who creates interventions into public life to he creates these interventions that reimagine individual, group, or I would say institutional behavior. He has exhibited at many places. He has exhibited at San Francisco Museum of the Modern Art, the Mercosul Biennial in Brazil, the Shanghai Biennial, the Carnegie International, the Lion Biennial, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Denver, the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College, New York, Museo Tamio Arte Contemporáneo, Mexico City. Now, I'm pretty sure I messed up the pronunciation there, so please bear with me. The list is pretty long, though. The list doesn't end here. Rusia Malmö in Sweden, Salzmanab Center for Contemporary Art, Tehran, as well as in our backyards, in our living rooms, and street corners. Rubin has achieved a lot. He has achieved a lot of rewards as well. I mean, a lot of awards. The list is pretty long there too. So he has received awards from Art Matters Foundation, the Creative Work Fund, Americans for the Arts, the Creative Capital Award, and he, I believe, was also the finalist for the International Award for Participatory Art. Conflict Kitchen, his collaborative 7-year work with the artist Don Wileski, was named as one of the 100 artworks that defined the decade by Art News. He recently collaborated with artist Lanka Clayton on projects for Solomon Guggenheim Museum in New York and the 15th edition of the Lions Biennial. John is a professor and a graduate director in the School of Arts at Carnegie Mellon University. John Rubin is here with us today to talk about his work with Conflict Kitchen. Just to give you a rough background about it, Conflict Kitchen is a restaurant that serves cuisines from countries with which United States is in conflict. Now, this is very, very interesting. I didn't even know about this till I read about it. It's so intriguing. Now, I really definitely want to visit this place, especially because I've come to know that each Conflict Kitchen iteration is augmented by events, performances, publications, and discussions that seek to expand the engagement that the public has with, you see, culture, politics, or issues at stake. Within that focus region. The restaurant rotates identities in relation to the current geopolitical events. Conflict Kitchen, I would say, uses social relations of food and economic exchange to engage the general public in discussions about countries, cultures, and people, the very people that you and I might know very little about, outside these polarizing rhetorics of governmental politics and maybe the very, very narrow lens of these media headlines. In addition, I feel the restaurant also creates a, I've been told, this restaurant creates a constantly changing site for ethnic diversity in the post-industrial city of Pittsburgh, as it has presented the only Iranian, Afghan, let me see, North Korean, Palestinian, and Venezuelan, the city that has ever seen, this place has served up. Now, I have to remind the viewers, this presentation is live through Zoom, as well as Erie Arts and Culture's Facebook page and their YouTube channel. So the session is going to be concluded in Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please type them in the text box. At the end of this presentation, I will read those questions to John and he can answer those. We thank you for being with us today, and we hope you enjoy this presentation. I'm really looking forward to this one. I hope you are too. Thank you. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Amanpreet. Hi, everybody. And so I know that Zoom is kind of awful in some ways. And I just want to encourage everyone that if they have questions throughout the talk, we're a pretty small group. So if you have any questions that come up, they could be logistic, they could be financial, they could be conceptual, political, just put them into the chat or the Q&A function. And then we can actually answer questions as we go to sort of break it up. And so it's not just me talking for a long period of time. So yeah, so feel free. I'm going to share my screen and do a little presentation on Conflict Kitchen and projects that kind of have informed Conflict Kitchen. And I know that this group is filled with people who are working in different civic spaces, thinking about the way in which you're collaborating with cultures in the cities in Erie specifically. I live in Pittsburgh. I've actually never been to Erie, unfortunately, but I would love to come at some point. And I'm really going to talk through kind of how the projects evolve and change. And I guess the theme is kind of how one thing leads to another. Oftentimes people will look at, especially something like Conflict Kitchen, which is a very complicated project, and say, oh, how did that, how did you ever think of it? And where did it ever come from? And it's very actually the byproduct of an incredibly organic and natural process that when I look back on it, seems remarkable, but while we were going through it, seemed kind of incremental and not very hard to do in the end. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen. And was there a question off the bat?
No, it was me just typing in that we can change that whenever you're ready, John. Erie Arts and Culture would love to give you a tour of our community.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to. Yeah, absolutely. We've had like 6 different trips up there, and then we keep, for whatever reason, canceling it. So yeah, so it's theme of how one thing leads to another. And then like Amanpreet, I guess if someone, or Patrick, if anyone has a comment, just let me know, because I can't really see. I guess I can sort of see, but I don't know how many of you here are familiar with Pittsburgh. And I guess that would be an interesting thing to know. If folks want to just like, if you do know about Pittsburgh, go ahead and like comment, because Pittsburgh's kind of an amazing place filled with 90 different neighborhoods. I'm from Philly. I lived in the Bay Area for a long time. And I came to teach at Carnegie Mellon University about 15 years ago. And this is a corner in East Liberty, a neighborhood in Pittsburgh that's got got a great history as a working class African-American neighborhood cultural center, which saw, as many neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, a lot of economic decline right after the mills left, and 60s, 70s, 80s, so I was teaching at Carnegie Mellon. I teach art, and I teach art in the public realm. And actually, I was renting storefronts in different neighborhoods in the city as a methodology of working with and collaborating with different neighborhoods. And the first project that kind of led to Conflict Kitchen, I'm going to show. This is after several years. At a certain point, I was running a billboard on top of the building, this place called the Waffle Shop, which I'll describe in a second, and Conflict Kitchen, which you can see kind of on the right-hand side. There were kind of 3 different initiatives happening. It used to be a building that was, was vacant for about 3 years before I rented this corner space. And this actually started as a class project, this project called the Waffle Shop, a reality show or talk show. And essentially the way it worked was, the first thing that I did with my students when I rented this storefront is talk to my neighbors. And my direct neighbor was the Shadow Lounge. And the Shadow Lounge, if you know anything about Pittsburgh, about 8 years ago, I think it stopped running, but it was like this kind of cultural hip hop center in the city that anyone who was in sort of the music scene knew about. And it brought, as hip hop does, right, everyone, different ages, different races, different socioeconomic backgrounds into the club at night. And so I was renting a space right next to a pretty vibrant institution that was actually doing a really great job of bringing kind of a diverse set of people together, the way in which music naturally does. And so the project that opened, and then very much after the first kind of semester working with the students, I sort of decided that this project needed a little bit more professionalism, and I took it over. But it was called a Waffle Shop. And so essentially we opened a functional waffle shop that was only open Friday and Saturday nights from 11 p.m. till 3 a.m. in the morning, which are kind of ridiculous hours for any restaurant to be open. And the premise was that we were open when the club was really hopping on Friday and Saturday nights. And so we thought our initial kind of audience participants would be people who are already, going next door. So the sign says, "Come in, yes, we really serve waffles," in case people thought we were some illusion. And then parenthetically, and if you want, you can also be on our talk show. And this was the kind of bait and switch that we'll talk about a little bit more with Conflict Kitchen. But it was something that I learned by running this thing called the Waffle Shop. So it looked like a waffle shop. It was a waffle shop. In the back of it was a talk show set. And so people would be invited to come in, especially in Pittsburgh. There's not a lot of places, at least at that time, to eat late at night. And the seduction was essentially carbs and sugar, right? Especially late at night. And lots of different folks would end up, over the 4 years that this project ran, coming into the restaurant. And then once they were in the restaurant, and once we were feeding them, we would then ask them if they wanted to be on a talk show that we were running every hour that we were open, in the back of the restaurant. And so we built a kind of ad hoc talk show set, and we invited anyone to be the host or the guest. Sometimes we would hire a host, sometimes it would be students who I was working with. But anyone, if you were eating, this woman actually, she came in literally just to celebrate her birthday. She's got glasses on with candles on the top. And she had no idea there was a talk show. And this guy was running, he actually lived in the neighborhood at the time and ran a weekly talk show. And so she just got up and was on his talk show. And then we would live stream this. This is kind of old school. This project, I think, started 12 years ago. So we're live streaming it on the internet, on our own website that we designed, that had archives of all the footage that we had over the years. And so this experiment, I think what I was interested in was, how do you bring people that normally wouldn't be engaging with each other together, right? And obviously food has always done that. And then once you have them in a restaurant, I mean, it's one thing for everyone to sit at their separate tables, have their separate conversations. The challenge is how to get them to actually engage in conversation with each other in a way that's like both playful and hopefully meaningful. And so over the years, we actually we had over 10,000 people come into the restaurant and get on stage. Not just 10,000 people eat. We figured probably like 20% of the people who came in to eat would actually feel like they wanted to get onto this crazy talk show that was happening in the back of the restaurant. And one of the nice things about a talk show is that even though the majority of us have probably never been on a talk show, we surprisingly all know how to behave on a talk show. All you have to do is be a version of yourself. This is actually Mayor Bill Peduto when he was still a city councilman. A lot of people kind of came through this place, and we started out open at night, and then we were open during the day. And I always thought of it as a kind of stream of consciousness documentary. So in many ways, it tells the story of our city through the specific perspectives of the people who came into the restaurant at any given point. So it was constantly shifting its content and identity. And you could see we would play a lot with the sort of methodologies of the set and the way in which we would engage people. So this project was going on, and I was learning a lot. I was learning that, that your funder could be the person eating in the restaurant, right? So anyone who had a waffle, whether they participated in the sort of performance or the show, was funding the sort of arts venue. They were also the audience members because they had to be, because it's a small restaurant, so you have to watch. And then they're also they're the performers. So anyone who walked in the door wore every hat that we needed, right, to be an arts institution. It wasn't this thing like, we make art over here in the corner, and then we try to convince people to come in and watch the art that we make. It was all this very closed, small loop. And I've always been kind of interested in the ways in which, you start by thinking of who your audience or participants or users are in an artwork, as opposed to just purely your visions and ideas, and then try to find an audience for it. So after several years, Dawn Waleski, who was working with me at Conflict Kitchen at the time, and I started this other project, which is Conflict Kitchen. And I'll go into greater detail into the Conflict Kitchen project. And it literally started out of the side door of the Waffle Shop restaurant. We put a wooden facade on, and we started running 2 restaurants out of the same kitchen. Like that door leads into our actual kitchen where initially we were cooking waffles. And the idea really came about in a kind of very simple way. We were talking about, we had run a restaurant for a while. We figured we could really engage people in a way that we never thought possible. People who normally would not consider themselves artists or participate in art. We were in a really interesting neighborhood, and we knew that Pittsburgh, at least, from my experience, I've been living in the Bay Area and I moved to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh at that time, maybe still now, I'm not sure, still kind of has a public identity with its sort of white Eastern European heritage, right? Pittsburgh is actually a pretty diverse city, but, it's known for pierogies, it's known for, it's known for steelworkers, and it's known for kind of, white culture. And that's fine, that's one of many cultures, but there's lots of really interesting things going on in the city. Additionally, I've been doing work for several years with friends who live in Iran. And as you know, in the news cycle, periodically, the United States starts kind of beating the war drums and making a case for, either sanctions or military intervention in Iran. And not just Iran, right? Many other places, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. We were talking to ourselves and thinking, how can we use the restaurant as a way of looking at the people who live in our community and looking at the countries specifically that maybe we're in conflict with in a completely different lens, right? And, food is this incredibly, it's a sense, right? So you experience food first by smelling it, right? You ingest it. It bypasses kind of your intellect. You've had your whole life of kind of building a vocabulary around food. It's not something that's actually quite alien to us. Now, new foods might seem kind of foreign and strange, but I find that people are more experimental about foods than they are about ideologies and politics and religions and experiences with people that they're not familiar with. So we thought perfect medium, right, to introduce people to things and cultures and people that they're not familiar with. So I'm going to present a short video that was made maybe after 4 years of running Conflict Kitchen. And it's a series of kind of news articles or news reels that present the project in a kind of macro way, and then after we look at that, I'll talk about kind of what happened on the ground on a daily basis. But what was interesting is, even though we were making this hyper-local, small loop project that was for the community that we were engaged in, it also somehow resonated outside of the city. So we'll take a look at that and see if this works.
Die USA sind in viele Konflikte verwickelt, ob militärisch wie noch bis vor kurzem in Irak, als Schutzmacht für Israel im Nahen Osten oder ideologisch verfeindet wie etwa mit Nordkorea, Venezuela oder Kuba. Diese Länder kennen viele Amerikaner nur als Bösewichte aus den Fernsehnachrichten. Das Takeaway-Restaurant Conflict Kitchen setzt da den Kochlöffel an und serviert wechselnde Menüs aus genau solchen Ländern.
التجربة هو خلق جو موات لمناقشة ثقافات الشعوب والسياسة الخارجية الأمريكية.
L'idea è di attirare i clienti con del buon cibo per poi coinvolgere in eventi o dibattiti mirati a stimolare proprio la conoscenza della cultura e della politica di alcuni stati come per esempio l'Iran, l'Iraq, Cuba, Venezuela e la Corea del Nord.
ويبدو أن فكرة المطعم تجاوزت ذلك بتوظيفها الطعام لإضفاء مسحة إنسانية على الحروب والنزاعات.
So you order Iranian food or Persian food, anywhere from $5 to $8, and they give it to you wrapped up in a wrapper that has conversations from people that are in that country.
It features the opinions of Palestinians living on the West Bank and in the United States.
Wenn man seine Köstlichkeiten auspackt, dann erfährt man etwas über Afghanistan, zum Beispiel, was ist die aktuelle Regierung oder was sind die Rechte der Frauen. Eine Art kulinarische Völkerverständigung.
I think what they do is fantastic. They inform people about issues that are otherwise unknown in the United States.
Viele Leute denken, wir Afghanen sind Terroristen, vor allem nach den Anschlägen des 11. September. Aber unser Land entwickelt sich weiter und das ist toll, dass man das hier lernen kann.
الشعب الامريكي بشكل عام شعب طيب، شعب بحاول بس يتعرف على شو اللي موجود في النزاع ما بين الفلسطينيين والاسرائيليين. هذه كانت لهم فرصه انهم يشوفوا من طريقه ثانيه غير عن الميديا العاديه اللي بيشوفوها على التلفزيون.
Meine Mutter kommt aus
Sorry about that. Well, that gives you kind of a basic overview. Sorry, I cut it off a little bit early. So maybe I'll talk through some of the more specifics related to the project. So like I said, we started off this was a kind of inexpensive endeavor. We had a kitchen we were already running. But the challenging part was actually the research, working with the communities that, from each of the countries that we were focusing on. And we first opened with an Iranian version. And as I said, I have friends who live in Iran and Iranian friends here in Pittsburgh. So that was kind of an easier introduction for us to start with. We then opened an Afghan version and a Cuban version. And here are some of the kind of facades that we used for the restaurant. So we, as you can see visually, the strategy here is not to just kind of blend in, right? It is to stand out. It is to announce our presence. and proudly so. And the way in which we researched the project was to travel to, when we could, we were traveling to some of the different countries that we were working on. Here we are in Palestine, working with a women's collective. Here working with a North Korean defector in South Korea, making dumplings. In people's kitchens, here we are in Cuba. Our chef, after the first year, we hired one of the best chefs in the city who really loved the mission of the project, Robert Serre, who decided he didn't want to work late nights and he wanted to work in a restaurant that was open during the day, that he could really also engage all of his kind of political research and interests and his cross-cultural culinary expertise. So Robert traveled with us to each of the countries that we worked with. So a lot of the food was based on kind of home recipes, right? We would do some sort of street food and home recipe combination. Food that everyone or anyone could kind of understand pretty quickly. And I kind of want to relate very quickly, like something that maybe I didn't realize until even after the project. So I grew up, I'm Jewish, and one of the big traditions we have with food is Passover, or the Passover meal. And one of the great things I've always loved about the Passover is that each element on the table, each piece of food that you eat has a very specific story. And that story is both cultural and it's also deeply political. Passover, to me, in the house I was raised in, was a social activist meal, right? We talked about the history of Jewish persecution and then the recognition because of that persecution, of the persecution of others. Even the persecution of the Egyptians under which the Jews, were enslaved. And so, this kind of tradition of like an annual meal that even when I was a kid, I barely paid attention to it, but eventually years accrue and you participate in the ceremony and and you share it with your children. And that idea of constantly doing it again and again and sharing the stories over and over and having those stories sort of accrue into a family is something that I think we did in Conflict Kitchen over 7 years of being there every day. That the stories of our cuisine, slowly accrued and hopefully seeped into the culture of the city. This is before the opening of our Venezuelan version of the project, and we would have a taste testing. So local Venezuelan families who had helped us with recipes would come, do the final taste test, tell us all the things we were doing wrong, because no one can cook any recipe completely correctly. And there's something beautiful about that the recipe, if you think about it in culture, is kind of like the original open source information. It's the thing that's so generously and readily shared between people. And but yet everyone, even though it has like a kind of particular flavor and sort of originating point, it's constantly mutating, and everyone has their version. Everyone has their take on it. And this idea was something that I think a lot of people identified with the project, that, we might not have ever gotten anything right, but we probably never got it fully wrong either. So we moved into a location called Schenley Plaza, which is a very busy, active plaza where the University of Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is the largest employer in the city, and Carnegie Mellon are kind of located all around it. And we went from when we were in East Liberty, at this point, we closed the waffle shop. At East Liberty at that point, in the neighborhood we were in, we would maybe get 30 people a day. So it was, small traffic. It was actually economically hard to keep it going. When we moved to Schenley Plaza, we were getting on a sunny day, 300 people. And it changed the kind of business model, and it changed the number of people who are actually engaging with the project and its ideas. Gave us a larger kitchen to work from. Every 6 or so months, we would completely change the identity of the restaurant. So in some ways, it's like the worst business model. You finally figure it out, you get everything working, people start to really like your food, and you change to another country. But to us, that was the point. The idea is to look at the fact that there are many places that the United States is in conflict with. There's many cultures that we're completely unfamiliar with outside of what we read in the newspaper. And there's many of those cultures who live in our city. And so we need to take that as an opportunity. So we, the Waffle Shop Talk Show was this point of connection, right? Where absolute strangers were meeting and having conversation. Now the takeout window became that point, and the conversation became contextualized very specifically around the cuisine and culture and daily lives of people from each country we were focusing on. So the employees that we were hiring, were people who were political science majors, who were studying, international relations, who had a absolute interest in the kind of mission of the project and happened to also work in the restaurant industry, right? Which actually, if you know, many people in the humanities end up working in the restaurant industry. So it kind of worked quite well. And then the food kind of functioned as this mechanism or device for disseminating stories and information. We became, in some ways, a kind of publishing venue. Each time the food left the door, it would also leave with information, interviews with people that were based in the country that we were working with, or people who were, expats or part of immigrant communities who had relocated into Pittsburgh. And a lot of the publications were really just, perspectives, inroads, small points of information that wasn't trying to explain the entire history of a country. They were trying to explain someone's daily life within it. This is a book of interview with kids in Cuba. This is a book of interviews with kids and their grandparents in Iran. And, we're asking the same questions that anyone, if you're having dinner with, you might ask, right? The kind of, curious questions that you would ask a kid. And you're getting the perspectives of a kid or a grandparent. And you're seeing how the kids and the grandparents relate to each other. And then kind of woven into that is how culture and politics play out. But it's not coming at you with sort of politics with a big capital P, with an ideology, with a, sort of, we're telling you to think X. Our goal was to introduce you to as many perspectives and viewpoints to actually complicate your idea of what, say, Iran or Cuba or Venezuela might be for people living there. This is a cookbook that was put out as a propaganda piece by the North Korean government, and we had a woman who was a home chef who had defected, and she annotated the entire cookbook, and so we printed that and gave it out. We gave over our Instagram account to people who were living in each of the countries that we were working with. So in this case, someone in Iran. This is a member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I think this is Iran again, and Cuba. So we didn't use our social media to, promote our own recipes. We were using it as a mechanism for other people to present, again, an entry point into their lives. Using every element that's sort of available and how one thing leads to another. This billboard above the building where we were originally located, the billboard company pulled out. I asked if I could use it as a sign system. And we started to use it for quotes from people who showed up at the restaurant, things that they were telling us. And so it was a way of kind of another way, I suppose, of amplifying perspectives and voices. So you have the food wrappers, you've got these books, you've got eventually other performances and events that we did. And here, a billboard that would change on a regular basis. Once we moved from the neighborhood, I kept the billboard going as an independent project called The Last Billboard, and invited artists from Pittsburgh and around the world to present text. This is actually a text that a Canadian artist gave us when Trump was elected. And this is a text from a local artist, Alicia Wormsley. So back to Conflict Kitchen and back to Shenley Plaza, we're in a busy location. we're starting to do lots of different kind of gatherings and meetings and events, sometimes actually not even related directly to the cuisine we're serving. At this point, we're serving Afghan food, but we're having a meeting with the local Sudanese community because there were a lot of issues going on with US-Sudan relations, and it's a kind of opportunity over food, which we created specifically for the event to kind of unpack those events. We had cooking lessons. This is with Layla Al-Haddad, who wrote the Gaza Kitchen Cookbook, where she Skyped in to teach local high school kids some of the recipes that she had learned growing up. This is a lunch hour, we would call it. This is with Afghan veterans. So these are Americans who served in Afghanistan, which is a different perspective on Afghanistan. We did many events with local Afghan community as well. We had a trivia show when you're waiting in line. So we have a big line. We're just like trying to take advantage of every single solitary moment and resource that we have captured someone to give them a new viewpoint or perspective or open up a new conversation. So in that small moment when you're waiting in line, we would give you a trivia show about the food we're serving or the culture. So this is a Haudenosaunee trivia. And what was nice is like these little micro communities would develop, right? Where people would get into discussions and debates while they were waiting in line. If you think about all the times you wait in line and you have nothing to do with the stranger in front of you or the stranger behind you, this was kind of our opportunity to loosen that social fabric and get people discussing and debating. And arguments fine, as long as people are talking. I think one of the things we're afraid to do in America is to talk to someone with a different political opinion who we don't know. Even frankly, people we know, we don't talk to very much. So how can we create a place where that happens? So again, in this kind of one thing leads to another methodology, some ideas Dawn and I would develop somewhere else and we'd bring it back to Conflict Kitchen. So we were invited at some point to be in this art biennial in Porto Alegre, Brazil. And we created a project called the Speech of the Swans. And what we were interested in was, at the time, this is when Barack Obama was still president, when Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela, was still around. And we were interested in Brazil as this place that we were, from our discussions with Brazilians, and Porto Alegre is a kind of political center in Brazil, as a place that kind of between ideals of socialism and capitalism, that it was, constantly in sort of a negotiation around. So this project happened in the main public plaza in Brazil. And I'm presenting this as a way of like showing how, as artists, sometimes you have to kind of like experiment and then take an idea that you've experimented with and try it again and iterate it again until it finally kind of really comes to fruition and makes sense. Anyway, so when you walked into this plaza, there's these signs that say free rides with Hugo Chavez and President Barack Obama. And where you would take these kind of, most people would take family or romantic rides on this lake in the main public plaza. You could pay to take one or you could take a free one with a sign that we had made. And we had actors, local Brazilians, who were playing Barack Obama and Hugo Chavez. And they would invite you to come take a ride with them. And while you took this kind of romantic sort of ride with a president, someone who, it's interesting, Chavez and Obama, both in their own way, are kind of like these blank slates that people really projected a lot of their desires and fears around. And in both countries, in very different ways. And so while you're, say, taking a ride with Obama, he would record. And he'd ask you the question that maybe a lover would ask on a swan ride, which is, what do you really think of me? After a while. And so people would tell them, well, listen, they wouldn't tell the actor, they're telling who they think Barack Obama is, what they think of him. And, or Hugo Chavez. So every Sunday, these two characters are out there in the park, giving rides, asking what the public thinks of them. And then in the afternoon, they would mount these podiums and they'd give speeches, which would be verbatim the public's opinions of them. And so they're not speaking as the political figures, they're speaking as the public. They're a vessel for the contradictory set of viewpoints that people project upon them. And if you can see, both Chavez and Obama are both in the middle of the water, speaking to the swans and the public. There's speaker systems around. And so it's this kind of strange, vast public performance that happens every Sunday. And much like the waffle shop, the content comes from the people who are participating, right? These aren't sort of speeches written by political figures or artists. They're written by the public and then spoken back to the public. So I'm going to go forward. So we did similar thing several times at Conflict Kitchen. We did one called the Cuban Speech, where we asked Cubans, both in Cuba and in the United States, to write a speech they wished Barack Obama would give about Cuba. This is before diplomatic relations were renewed. And we hired, this time, the #1 Barack Obama impersonator in the country. And he performed this speech. I'll give you a quick sample. And while you're waiting for your Cuban food, right, because we have this line where people are just sitting around waiting, you would hear this speech. And again, it's a way, almost a bait and switch, a methodology of seducing people into listening to the viewpoints of everyday Cubans through, the persona of our president at the time.
I actually forget the last time I had anything to say about Cuba, and I find that upsetting. We like to talk a lot about defending human rights, but then we have trade and have close ties to China and Vietnam and Russia. Just imagine if the United States had to exist for a week under the Cuban regime. We would eliminate so many American problems. I firmly believe that we should return Guantanamo Bay to Cuba. I mean, even the British returned Gibraltar to Spain. It is outrageous for us to have prisoners there. The only reason Bush sent prisoners from Iraq to Cuba is to torture them in Cuba.
So this goes on. It's quite a long speech. And then there's a published version of it as well. So you can see whose perspectives it were. We don't name anyone's names because there are obviously political ramifications for some folks living in Cuba, but we tell like how old someone is, what their profession is, and then you get to see their perspectives and take it with you. So some of the other projects or events or things that we did in addition to the food is you could have your lunch with a local Iranian. So the way we did this during our Iranian version was anyone who was Iranian was able to eat for free. They just needed to share their lunch with anyone who showed up. So it was a very simple way, again, of getting strangers to engage with each other. We did live events. This is a live Skype meal between Pittsburgh and Tehran where we cooked the same exact recipes and connected ourselves through a video screen. So you can't see the screen, but it actually is on a wall that we're both looking at. So we're kind of connected our tables to the wall. So it looks like we're in a big dinner party. We held virtual cooking lessons. This is before everyone was on Zoom. This seemed like a novel thing, but everyone would be who signed up would get the same recipe. They'd go shop in their country for the ingredients, and then in this instance, a chef in the upper left is walking you through how to cook an Iranian recipe, and then everyone sits down and eats together. Another project that was developed in other cities was called The Foreigner. And this is kind of like a human avatar project. And the way it worked, this is was first developed in Cleveland with a place called Spaces. And on the left, you see, say the posters in the middle, on the left-hand side is the local avatar. I mean, someone who's from Cleveland, who has a headset on and is live connected to someone from Iran. So in the upper portion, there's a man who's connected to a young girl in Iran. And anything that girl says, that man repeats to the public. And so we located this in the mall and in the library. And so essentially, you're communicating with someone in a foreign country through the body of someone who seems local. And I'll show you sort of how this happened at the restaurant. So say during our Iranian version of the project, someone like on the right, Elise, who used to work at the restaurant, was live connected to Sohrab. Sohrab's in Iran. And so everything that Sohrab says, Elise repeats. And the customer has a microphone, and everything the customer says, Sohrab hears in Iran. So I'll give you a kind of an example. It's a little complicated, but once you see it, it kind of becomes quite simple. So here on the right, Tracy, who is a Pittsburgh actress, is the human avatar for Mohammed, who lives in East Jerusalem, Palestine. And so she is simultaneously herself. You have your expectations of who Tracy is as someone from Pittsburgh, as an African-American woman. And she is also voicing Mohammed live. So she is embodying someone else from a different place with a different background and many different experiences. I'll play like a little clip.
And also the Islamic State is on the move. Is that a threat to you, or is that too far away?
First of all, those are not Muslims.
No.
They're disguising themselves as Muslims, but they are mercenaries.
Oh, okay.
They are mercenaries. They're not doing the work for Allah. So what about you? I still think you're young, I believe so.
Yes.
But what do you think about the future? Are you going to get married, a Middle East guy, or someone from...
I think my parents would want me to marry an Indian Muslim guy like myself.
I believe that your parents are looking for a good future for you. You know, they're worried about you, and they want you to have a good life for you.
Yes.
But don't just take it easy with them.
Okay.
Because they're always thinking it and they're always caring about you.
Thank you.
So Tracy then would work with us with area schools. We would hook the school kids up with people who were living in the countries we were focusing on. The kids would do this with each other. And, you know, it's the kind of ultimate empathic act, is to literally embody someone else's language. Their ideas are coming through you. And, you know, in the United States, we, you know, have a history of xenophobia. This is, you know, well ensconced in our culture. And so how do you kind of complicate identity? You know, question what you think you know or should know based on what you're looking at, or what you sort of read, or what you expect someone to be and behave like. And so these are some of the kids. So there's a lot of things that happened during the time of complication. In Pittsburgh, there was an awful hate crime against a Muslim taxi driver. And, you know, and at this point, we've been around for 4 or 5 years, and we were able to work with the local Islamic Center, which is really just a mile up the road. And, you know, our kind of strategy was constantly to center food around anything we were doing. So what we did after this kind of headline hit our local paper, and there was a lot of concern and a lot of just ignorance, frankly, was to invite everyone who was interested to come to the local Islamic Center, working obviously with them, and working with different members of the Muslim community on these sort of roundtables. And so over 300 people showed up within a week, which was kind of remarkable. And we had a potluck. So everyone brought food. And then at each table was, you know, you could sign up, but you would have to listen. The goal here was not to sort of espouse your perspectives on what was going, but to listen to someone from the local Muslim community tell you what their experience in the city was like. And that is varied. And again, what brings this many people together so quickly? Food, right? A potluck. If we all just sat and had a speaker, right, or a panel, these things are kind of like, they're deadening. They're, you know, to be honest, they're sort of impersonal and distancing. And so, you know, how can we use what is already happening in everyone's homes, and how can we use that as a way of sort of creating space for sharing? So it's not a radical thing that this project is doing. We're really doing a very basic thing. We're connecting to what everyone knows. We're just maybe making combinations of narratives that people aren't comfortable usually with or familiar with, and having people encounter people that they might not normally encounter. But actually that bridge, once crossed, was, quite easy to maintain, and and I think quite comfortable for people to make the journey through or over. This is our Palestinian version of the project, and this is our right before we opened, having the taste test. We traveled to Palestine. This is a woman making maftool, which is it's kind of like a couscous. And one of the things that's very sensitive for many Palestinians is how Israeli culture has kind of co-opted many foods that have been part of the region for forever. So there's a lot of people, myself included, I knew Israeli couscous when I grew up, but maftool is something that's been in the Levant forever. And one of the really nice things has been part of our travels. We met these two women who, for generations, have been maintaining these olive groves, and we were able to purchase their season's harvest that we had shipped to Conflict Kitchen, and then bottled with a story that went around. In addition to the bottle, there's a small story on the back, but there's a whole pamphlet that goes. It gives kind of history of this family and how they define resistance as just farming, maintaining the land that they've had for generations. And I think the Americans have an idea of what resistance looks like, what Palestinian resistance looks like, and it's usually, they see it as acts of violence that they're seeing on the front pages of newspapers, but resistance is actually is persisting on a daily basis in many different ways. And then we would use that for the education and outreach programs that we developed. So we had a kind of strange hybrid of a for-profit restaurant and a nonprofit educational program. Here's during that version, there was a incursion into Gaza that Israel government had made. And this is an Instagrammer who lived in Gaza that was taking photographs. There's tunnels that go underneath Gaza into Egypt, and they're often, again, narrativized as these kind of terror tunnels. But really what often they are tunnels for people to survive when they're blockaded from things like chocolate, gum, formula milk, soda, turkey, meat, etc. This is a family eating outside their home. Our Palestinian version was actually one of the most popular that we had. The food's amazing. People were really curious, actually didn't know much about Palestine. But additionally, it ended up, for some people, being controversial. And so the Jewish Federation of Pittsburgh did not like our focus because they felt that we were not focusing on Israeli voices. Now, the United States really is not in conflict with Israel. We are in conflict with Palestine through our support for Israel. And that's a fact that some people like to refute. But that said, over the years, we've always focused on, Iranians, Afghans, Venezuelans, North Koreans. We never asked for an American or another viewpoint. And it was interesting that other viewpoint was being asked in this case. There were articles that started to show up in the local newspaper calling our focus one-sided or anti-Israeli. US Jews outraged over Pittsburgh's restaurant's Palestinian menu, which is ironic because I am one of the US Jews who was not outraged by it. There was sort of a narrative being built to prevent essentially the types of viewpoints and ideas and opinions that Palestinians have about Israeli government policy. And that happens a lot in American public life, unfortunately. The Federation tried to get all the right-wing media to kind of bite on this story, and eventually they did. And so Fox News, we received funding from the Heinz Endowments, which is Heinz Ketchup, based here in Pittsburgh. Secretary of State John Kerry at the time was married to Teresa Heinz. And so Fox News, in its typical way, kind of spun this story. Anti-Israeli restaurant receives funding from John Kerry's wife's foundation. Then Breitbart turns it into John Kerry's wife funds radical anti-US, anti-Israeli eatery. So this is, this is like, after 4 years of Trump, we're all familiar with this, right? This shit makes sense. Like, this is the right wing creating their own narrative, taking bits and pieces of information, distorting them, trying to scare people, trying to control the stories that they don't wish to, exist in the public realm, and trying to be honest, vilify cultures that don't fit, right? Their easy, basically white supremacist model, to state it flatly. One of the most challenging moments we had was when the Heinz Endowments, which is actually a really amazing foundation, pretty progressive, under pressure from B'nai B'rith, which is a large Jewish organization, which I think just got bits and pieces of this, disavowed their funding to our project. So now we've been around for 5 years. We're a very popular project. It was interesting that our focus on Palestine somehow switched the perspective from a foundation under a lot of pressure on the success of our project. After several weeks of all of this kind of happening in the background, we started to receive death threats and had to close the restaurant. And this is just, this is sad. This is like the byproduct of like some awful and insane mind trying to, quiet us. And fortunately, we've been around for enough that we'd build a kind of relationship with a lot of folks in Pittsburgh who supported both the project and really were interested in supporting the local Palestinian community that this project was focusing on, right? So imagine all this is going on and you're a Palestinian citizen living in a Palestinian American living in Pittsburgh, what this means, what this says about your culture, that it's being attacked so, so specifically. And so there were rallies held outside the restaurant. People posted notes of support on the facade while we closed. And when we reopened, people came out in droves to support the project. And the project has always been supporting or always been focusing, on oftentimes people who don't receive a lot of focus in our city or in our country. And that became really explicit for our customers. A lot of people, to be honest, there's always people coming who are just like, this food's great. I don't really want to read the material. I just want to, just give me the falafel. And that's fine. That's one perspective. And maybe if you came by the 10th time you've had the food, you're going to open up to the stories, or you're going to come to an event or a screening or meet someone from the community. But, a lot of people, the politics sometimes were buried underneath the surface. And this brought a lot of those politics and the cultural issues that are playing out into the public. We also did a Juneteenth version of the project on 2 years at the 150th anniversary of Juneteenth, working with local Black and African American chefs. And we also focused on the kind of, the racism and that happens to, Native people in our country, because, obviously we're built on this as a nation. This was a photograph that appeared while we were running the project. And it's, it's a very racist photograph that was on the front of our newspaper, the city's newspaper. And when I saw it, I just couldn't believe it, right? This is actually here. And I'm like, well, the caption has to be like, these mascots, this face painting, has to be challenged, has to be upended, has to be, thought of differently. And really what it was get ready for game one. Cleveland Indians pose for a picture, right? So this is the type of invisibility Native people have in the United States, where you can have such a kind of what seems like benign to many Americans, but is actually a really, racist act. So we worked with the Haudenosaunee, which is more commonly known by many people as the Iroquois Confederacy of Nations, which are mostly, located in upstate New York and Canada, but has a long history of, in our region and in Pittsburgh. And so this was actually, in some ways, the most local cuisine, right? Many of the foods, Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse, and it's a confederacy of 6 nations. Many of the foods were as local as you get. You know, this is the Three Sisters, this is venison. And interestingly, many people were sort of like, these flavors seem so unusual. You know, I've never had like, you know, cranberries, venison, potatoes. The spices seem very minimal, and they really are. And it was just this great opportunity to kind of open a conversation that, you know, about a nation, or about a set of nations that have been here before we got here, that the United States is still actively in conflict with, that perhaps many people in our own city didn't know about. So I'm going to I think I'm going to wrap up here. And let me see. Yeah, so, I mean, in brief, I think one of the things that, to me, made the project successful, and if I go back to the model of Passover, was just that we were there every day. We didn't pop up. It wasn't just a kind of idea that sort of came and go. We were part of the city's culture. And in that, I think we were learning just as much as we were sharing over the years. And people, I think, felt as they came to the restaurant that they were contributing to the identity of what we were doing. And so, yeah, maybe I'll stop there and we can have some questions, and if you have any, I'll pull out.
We do have one question in the Q&A box. Amanpreet, if you'd like to open that up and read it to John. You're currently on mute, Amanpreet.
Okay. So Mira here has a question for you, John. It says, amazing work that you're doing. Which one was your most favorite one?
I mean, most favorite, like cuisine, or, I mean, I don't think I really had, it would change. In terms of cuisine, it would change. And that was the beautiful thing, is sort of you get used to and introduced to cuisines that, you know, to be honest, I had no experience with often. And then, you know, it's sort of become your favorite. And for many people, like, they became regulars of a specific country because of the cuisine. Either they were from that country, or they just like completely got turned on to this food. And then we would shift on them, and there was always this kind of uncomfortable period where people were sort of disappointed. And then they would sort of fall in love again, hopefully, often, with a new cuisine. So to me, I was very lucky. I just got to constantly learn and eat new food. So I don't think there was a favorite per se.
Thank you. Our next question is from an anonymous person, and they want to ask, how were the quotes for the interviews chosen to put on the packaging?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Oh, one sec, it's gone. They basically wanted to know how were the quotes that were put on, how were they chosen?
Okay, yeah. So through just a long process of talking to a lot of people, and trying to find kind of a variety of viewpoints. I mean, certainly if there was a kind of consensus around a specific topic or issue, we would probably present viewpoints that were more within the consensus. But we were always trying to show kind of, you know, sometimes even completely opposite ideas that people might have about food, about culture, about politics, about marriage, about child rearing, about bread, about so in each case, trying to kind of open up a different perspective. I think that was something we always thought about. We couldn't present absolutely every interview we've ever done, but we also knew there'd be lots of opportunities for us to have events and gatherings in which if people were interested, they could learn more.
Right. So I have another question from Elizabeth, And she wants to know, how are you continuing these conversations in a COVID world? Very relevant question.
Well, this project, when it actually is conflict kitchen doesn't exist right now. So we went from 2010 to 2017. And then at that point,
okay.
so yeah, so we lasted for 7 years, which is a long time for a restaurant to be around. And then both Dawn and I have gone separate ways and have worked on other projects. And there's many people who've kind of taken the model of Conflict Kitchen and incorporated it into their own project.
So do you think people in other countries, they are still continuing with this idea? And
yeah, we've had.
Do you know of any?
We've had, oh yeah, folks in Poland, in the UK, not exactly this, but a lot of people. I mean, still, 4 years after the project's done, we still get emails probably on a monthly basis from people who are like interested in the model and whether they can use a component part. And back to the idea of, I think of it just as a recipe, right? Mm-hmm. That anyone can modify it for their own situation. Perhaps it doesn't make perfect sense to do the exact thing in any other place, but it's exciting to us that people seem interested in incorporating it into their own cities.
So do all those emails motivate you to reconsider your decision that you do?
But I mean, the decision was kind of it was a life business decision. It was very, very complicated to run a restaurant and a nonprofit, and economically it was often very tight and difficult to do. So, it's, yeah.
So I have a question here. They want to know, are there any plans to do more projects like this?
Yeah, I mean, I do projects like this, not this specific, but, I just created a project called The Other Apartment with my friend Sohrab Kashani, who lives in Iran, which is an exact replica of his apartment and all of his possessions, as a place in Pittsburgh at the Mattress Factory Museum that was here for a year, which was a way of us creating a world together that bypassed kind of geography and ideologies and sanctions. So I'm constantly thinking and working on different ideas that I think relate to some of the premises, but whether I'll create a project that is a restaurant that deals with cultures that the United States or countries the United States is in conflict with, I'm not sure.
Okay. So Sherry here has a comment and a question. She says, you have made a remarkable impact spanning Pittsburgh with the world. What would you like to see other towns such as Erie do or need to do based on your enlightened worldview?
I mean, I think that's really up for each place to think about. It's funny because I don't know if enlightened worldview is a generous way of describing me or anyone, because I feel like partly the reason I did the project was maybe because I'm not enlightened, as a way of learning and knowing and recognizing my ignorances and creating a place that could challenge them and inform or challenge my ignorance and inform me. And so I do think, I think of the project as like an educational project, maybe at its core. I mean, I'm an artist, so I think of it as a public artwork. I think of it as just a business, but I also think of it as a project in pedagogy, in kind of collective knowledge, accumulation and sharing in the city. As a professor at a university, we have such a privileged space, right? To kind of, so many amazing people, the students come and they're automatically able to kind of really dig deeply into lots of cultures, lots of things that they're uncomfortable with and unfamiliar with. And the challenge is how to bring the utopic qualities of like a university education into the public square. How to have that as a shared experience that we all have access to. And I think it does happen in different ways, right?
Right.
But so, yeah, I don't know. I think other cities certainly are manifesting these, the same central premise, but in their own way. And if anyone's interested in sort of like some of the things that we did, I would say, great. That's go for it.
John, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
And the only reason I'm asking it aloud instead of typing it is, as a host, I can't type into the Q&A function. A lot of our intended core audience for these conversations are artists, nonprofit organizations, advocacy groups, etc. And I know that to drive forward with this work always requires financial resources of one form or another, which means for a lot of us applying to grants with support from foundations, whether local or national. And a lot of times those foundations want to know what is your impact, what is your desired outcomes, and what are the metrics you're using to communicate back to us that you were successful in this project. So with Conflict Kitchen, knowing that you did have some grant funding, what were you looking at as far as desired outcomes, stated impacts, and then what metrics did you track and report back to your funders?
So it's kind of interesting. We're the restaurant art project, say education, each one has its own bucket. So as a restaurant, the metrics are you staying alive, right? Are you able to employ everyone, buy all the food, just pay the rent, fix the fryer when it breaks? Can you survive with every other business? And we were pretty fortunate to be fairly successful in that, and to actually at times have money from the restaurant side that we could put towards this sort of education or maybe nonprofit side, the activities, the publications, the events that we did. And that we didn't, there was no kind of going to a grantor and having to fill out, fit their guidelines and then report back that you successfully met their guidelines, which I think are not inherently bad, but often restrictive, right? Because what you want to do is be creative and respond to the moment, so maybe something happened where the event at the Islamic Center that was never on our radar. We never thought we were going to do it. We certainly didn't make any money doing it, but we felt it was an important thing to do, and we were able to respond to it. Maybe a grantor wouldn't have fit into the guidelines that we reported back. So that was where the restaurant helped to kind of bypass, in a productive way, the restrictions that you find, or metrics, in grant guidelines. And then, the grant side, let's say because we did get some grants, some from a local foundation, an individual who just believed in the project. And the Heinz Endowments and a couple of other small foundations. So those, we would say, hey, we want to develop an education and outreach program. We want to work with area schools. They're coming to us. This seems like a great opportunity. So that was where we would have to, in a very traditional way, say how many schools we'd work with, what would the lessons be, what would we be trying, in a good way and a bad way, it was very quantitative. Right? It's a numbers, how many people type of situation. I think the good way is that it forces you to actually really reach folks. The bad way is that sometimes it's just, the numbers don't mean the quality necessarily. And if you're just meeting the numbers, do you have the flexibility to do things that maybe you don't fit into the grant? So this is now the middle bucket, which is the artist bucket talking to you, because as an artist, I really don't, metrics I think are problematic, because what it does is it's so transactional. Everything is boiled down to its economic value. I know there are great people working at many of these foundations, and their heart is in the social missions of what's going on. But we get forced into these kind of economic bottom lines to validate our processes. And so when you have like the Heinz Endowments disavow their funding because they don't like the focus that you're doing, are they doing that because of an economic reason? Probably at the core. I don't know if it was really a philosophical one. The president of the Heinz Endowments apologized 4 years later for what he did. And as an artist, one of the things that I think, and as you said, there's many artists here, you know, I think we work best in the seams of society, outside of like the kind of norms that regiment our activities into, you know, forms of like economic stimulation. And I'm not against sort of, you know, economic prosperity being shared, but I just, I'm kind of giving you an answer you may not have wanted, but I get this question a lot. And I think it's instructive for artists to, you know, that sometimes we have to be beholden to the vision of the work more than kind of the metric of the grantor.
So John, just a quick thing. This is to the professor. Could we see a book in the future about your experiences, or the conflict between the artists that you just mentioned and the economics of doing such a project? Something along those lines?
Look at
or
the
just
future.
The very experience of Conflict Kitchen?
When you say look at the future, how do you mean?
I mean, in the future, I mean, do we see a book in the future that we get to read, since we don't have the restaurant now to go to?
Oh, I don't know. There was a point in which we were going to be making a cookbook, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the specific future. I think it's probably many things. I don't think it's like a singular thing. And I, you know, I mean, hopefully, again, I think the future is that other people have been influenced by it. I don't think it really has. I'm not. I don't really care that like Conflict Kitchen itself is important in the future. I think it's like any artwork, where you would hope that you would influence or inspire or shift someone in some capacity to incorporate something that they've experienced that has moved them into what they are doing. And that's a kind of unmeasurable, ineffable thing. And I do think existing in some way, having some presence, I mean, we have talked about documenting it so people can know that the project exists, but I don't think like the thing in and of itself needs to go on for it to resonate in some way.
As of now, I don't think so. We have any more questions from the audience. So I thank everyone at this point for joining us, and we thank John, of course, for sharing his insights with us. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming.